I think now is the time for me to delightedly introduce Josh. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Josh because I've had the very great pleasure of supervising Josh on our doctoral program in education and social justice. So as you'll see there, Josh has got a fantastic title. I love this title. You can read it for yourselves, Poetry and Pose. You're reading it for yourselves, so I won't repeat it. But this looks to be really interesting. And I know there's quite a lot of people in our department, increasingly, I think, who are interested in autoethnography as a method. And so Josh has used what he calls braided autoethnography. So it'll be interesting to hear about that. Josh is he's taught in secondary schools, taught English in secondary schools for many years. And he's particularly interested in the effects of hegemonic masculinity upon pedagogical efficacy in secondary school education. So I'll hand over to Josh, and then if you have questions, please put them in the chat or wait until the end, and we'll use a combination of chat and raising your hand in the old-fashioned way as well. So please, everybody, mute themselves and turn off their cameras too. And it's over to you, Josh.
Okay, thank you so much, Jo. I really appreciate that introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's in the audience tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Or I should say today. I'm in Singapore, and so it's tonight for me. My name is Josh Kernay, and I'm a PhD student in the Education and Social Justice program in the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. My thesis supervisor, as she mentioned, is Dr. Jo Wehren, professor in Gender and Social Relationships in Education at Lancaster, and I'm scheduled for my Viva next month. I'm a career secondary school English teacher, and I've spent my career in Denver, Colorado, USA, and in Singapore, where I've lived for the last 9 years. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Jo Wehren for her guidance and patience. And I'd also like to thank Dee Dalgleish, Project Administrator for the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University, for her management and promotion of this event, as well as for her kind and supportive communication in the lead up. So for tonight's presentation, I'm just going to take you through my research and my research question, aim, and objectives to begin. How and why do heterosexual male secondary school English teachers present gender identity in the classroom? And my aim is to describe the experience of heterosexual male secondary school English teachers' expressions of gender in the classroom. And I have 3 objectives: to locate and describe my lived experience as a heterosexual male secondary school English teacher, to research and describe the experiences of other heterosexual male secondary school English teachers, and then apply theory of hegemonic masculinity, gender identity, queer theory, and secondary English pedagogy to the findings of my research and recommend changes to ameliorate issues of social justice in education. I'm obviously interested in issues of social justice, especially in the secondary school classroom. Gender bias has enormous implications for how students fare in school, and this bias becomes more and more complicated with intersectional considerations of class, religion, race, and sexuality. It's easy for teachers like me, white heterosexual men situated in heteronormative educational settings within larger heteronormative societal arenas, to express ourselves unchecked and with hegemonically masculinized tropes regarding identity. I can do what I like, more or less. No one will question me, ever. My identity, including class, religion, race, sexuality, and gender, and its expression has never in my career been questioned. I generally walk untroubled through the world in my identity because of unearned privilege. I've also been aware of a phenomenon in my experience as a secondary school teacher for the last 23 years that I have not been able to fully articulate until having the time within this program to do so. It regards the distance I feel between what it means to be a man in the world and the man I am when I'm teaching. When I first proposed this concept to my supervisor, there was dead silence, and then she asked me to explain that again. I feel that this distance can be vast. My construction of gender identity can seem so very different in my everyday life than it is in my classroom. There had to be something in this. The way I seemed easily, and of course in an untroubled way, code switch from hegemonically masculinized tropes of gender identity in the world, if you will, and a very different construction of that masculinity while teaching. It seemed almost as if I had two very different presentations of my identity. As I began researching ideas about this phenomenon as it relates to my question, I found that other theorists in fields of education, gender, sexuality, and even qualitative research methodology had similar questions regarding the contextual construction of identity and the dissonance of subjective experience in fields in which we consider ourselves complete member researchers, or CMRs, Adler and Adler 1987. Much of what I read, particularly Raewyn Connell's theory of hegemonic masculinity, Carol Gilligan's 1981 theory of the feminist ethic of care, Wayne Martino's 2008 research on queer identity and pedagogy, my supervisor Jo Waren's research on gender identity and the contextual construction of it for educators, especially her Stories of Self 2010 and her research with Dempster in 2007 and Gannerud in 2014, began to coalesce into a theoretical framework that informed my research. Another reason I was inspired for this research was because of the three most important women in my life: my daughter, my partner, and my mother. I want to use my platform as a researcher so that I might strengthen social justice in education in order to help those who write educational policy and philosophy better understand how gender and identity influences teaching and learning. For my young adult daughter, who is heading off to university in the fall, I want her to experience teachers, lecturers, and professors who are aware of the influence of heteronormative cultural biases and the invisible grip of hegemonic masculinity upon teaching and learning. For my wife, also a career school teacher, I hope she will work with colleagues who understand and think critically about the profound influence of often unexamined expressions of masculinity upon their teaching practices and professional relationships. And for my mother, a retired reading specialist and kindergarten teacher who spent nearly 40 years in American public school classrooms, I'd like to honor her legacy of teaching thousands of fortunate students in situations which were, in all probability, androcentric, hypermasculinized, and oppressive towards her lived experience as a brilliant female educator, colleague, and employee. I'd like to comment upon areas for my literature review, including hegemonic masculinity, the ethic of care, gender and identity, gender and performance, and queer theory in education. The first area of theoretical concentration regards hegemonic masculinity. This theory is influential in my research and has guided my thinking. It coalesces a political concept, hegemony, from Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci's 1929 writings in his prison notebooks regarding how power wielded by the hegemon can influence and control a large group, which he termed subalterns. Connell, along with Kerrigan and Lee in 1985, theorized that Gramsci's political theory could also apply to gender. Masculinity becomes hegemonic in this new application. The essentialized masculine qualities of strength, independence, courage, lack of emotion, physicality, power, decisiveness, et al. Are valorized in a hegemonically masculine culture, while essentially feminine qualities of caring, receptivity, community, emotion, and patience are pathologized in men. And the ultimate pathologizing of these qualities is attached to homosexuality in men. The concept of dislocating masculinity from gender, then, was very compelling for me. How and why did I feel so differently when I symbolically traversed the doorway to my classroom? The direction I was traveling through that doorway seemed to determine my construction of masculinity. The ethic of care, Gilligan, 1982, seemed to begin to inform me of the phenomenon which I was trying to describe within the cultural phenomenon theorized by Connell. Gilligan's feminist ethical consideration of care is a reaction to Lawrence Kohlberg's 1981 androcentric theory of moral development, which was predicated on a Kantian tradition of morality in which only boys were considered for his study, that girls were not included in Kohlberg's extremely influential study and were considered deficient in that system of ethical development was Gilligan's argument for a new consideration of what ethical behavior entailed. Quote, different perspectives of males and females in their moral development are reflected in two different moral ideologies, since separation for males is justified by an ethic of rights, while attachment for females is supported by an ethic of care, unquote. Additionally, Nell Noddings, also influential theoretically in developing the ethic of care, suggests that it is in the deep classical sense of femininity rooted in receptivity, relatedness, and responsiveness, and that it is the recognition of and longing for relatedness that form the foundation of our ethic, and the joy that accompanies the fulfillment of our caring enhances our commitment to the ethical idea that sustains us as the one caring. As I read Gilligan's and Noddings' theoretical frameworks, I began to recognize myself as a teacher and the ethical system which I aspire to in the classroom, one rooted in caring and community rather than in a Kohlbergian masculinized independence. I had a real problem on my hands. It was as if Gilligan, Noddings, and Noddings to a certain extent were informing me away from the assumed masculinized identity that I had without thinking much, lived my life. These considerations led me to reading about gender and identity as well as gender and performance. If hegemonic masculinity and the theory of the ethic of care are larger Bourdieusian fields of sociological existence for me, then gender theory is much more local to my question. Gender theory seemed to inform me regarding my day-to-day, hour-to-hour, and even minute-to-minute constructions of identity when I teach. In particular, Warren's analogy of a snail and chameleon to one's gender identity proved influential for my theoretical framework. Warren's concept suggests that essentialized expressions of gender identity, as a snail carries its shell from context to context, are different than the way that a chameleon changes its color to reflect the context in which it finds itself. I suppose I aspire to be much more of a chameleon and much less of a snail. Furthermore, Lingard and Douglas's concept of the patriarchal dividend that men like myself receive in a hegemonically masculine landscape is clear if I choose to behave without considering the implications of my untroubled gender expression. I automatically receive the benefit. Also, for excellent reading regarding a kind of hypermasculinized existence, Lancaster professor Carolyn Jackson's work regarding ladism in schools was helpful for me to consider kind of an upper boundary of masculinized expression, along with Skelton's 1993 work regarding the implied masculinity of PE teachers and students. However, Lingard and Douglas and other gender theorists suggest that I can work to disencumber myself of my unearned privilege of an easy, untroubled expression of masculinity, and that this is an important consideration and one that catalyzes me. Queer theory in education became important for my reading and research as I began to understand the implications in theory regarding the dislocation of gender identity and sex role, of female masculinities and male femininities, and non-binary gender expression. Becky Francis, Jack Halberstam, and Wayne Martino have been helpful here, particularly Francis's application of Mikhail Bakhtin's linguistic concepts of heteroglossia and monoglossia to gender expression. Francis suggests that we must, quote unquote, celebrate heteroglossic, non-essentialized expressions of gender, and this theoretical suggestion has been influential for my research. Martino's research regarding what makes a good male role model within a hegemonically masculinized heteronormative cultural milieu has also been instructive for me. I feel that men like me are under the auspices that we must espouse the heteronormative, essentialized qualities of being men so that we can signify safe in the classroom. Martino argues that this culturally valorized male role model or even savior is deeply homophobic. His argument serves to catalyze my research as well. It's been my experience as a secondary school teacher that my identity as a straight male within a heteronormative school culture has allowed me to never, not once, be questioned about my gender identity, sexuality, sex role, or otherwise. Quite a different experience, I would imagine, from a teacher with different intersectional identities than mine. Unlike many of my colleagues, I can toggle between stereotypical male behaviors in the world and a caring, sensitive, emotional, uncertain, some might say kind-hearted, and even empathetic man in class. The world away from my classroom does not demand or even expect any of these qualities from me at any time, ever. And this tacit cultural acceptance of an essentialized, untroubled, and hegemonic masculinity is not socially just. I'd like to talk about my methodological approach, my foundations, my positionings, a dialectic within the methodology, and then the methodology that I landed on, braided autoethnography, and then my method and selection of participants. So the methodology, foundations of autoethnography is an approach to research and writing that seeks to, sorry, let me start again there. Autoethnography is an approach to research and writing that seeks to systematically analyze, graphy, personal experience, auto, in order to understand cultural experience, ethno. This works well for me because I want to systematically analyze, graphy, my personal experience, auto, as a heterosexual male secondary school English teacher to further understand and then describe how I perform gender identity in a secondary school classroom, ethno. In other words, my aim seems to fit the methodology. As I began to read about autoethnographic methodology and traditions and began to understand the unconventional nature of it, I was attracted to it. This liminality and contestability of the methodology, Denzin 2017, is in its current form what drew me to it. My qualitative research question is not designed to find an objective truth, nor is it one that can be validated necessarily by others' experiences. I also had a feeling that my methodological choice would be unconventional because of my rather unconventional positioning. I'm a heterosexual male teacher grounded in feminist queer theory as it applies to education. Additionally, and one of the first concepts I learned as a PhD student at Lancaster when I began the program in 2017, was how to define myself epistemologically and ontologically as a researcher. I determined quite quickly that I'm an anti-foundational relativist and that these positionings are foundational for my methodological choice. Further training in Lancaster's program has helped me understand how far my positioning is from the implied objectivities of realism or positivism. I struggled mightily with coursework in these more traditional areas of methodological consideration and learning, and this painful recollection of my struggles guided my thinking towards progressive qualitative research traditions like these. Also, because I'm a feminist researcher, I must foreground my voice and the voices of others in the research because, as Gilligan notes, a positivist sociological research tradition developed by men occludes or even erases women's voices and experience. It would be easy for me to do otherwise and, as Connell warns, dodge among multiple meanings of masculinity and gender identity to suit my research needs. In an autoethnography, the writer foregrounds their voice. In an autoethnography, there's not an implied objective outcome to be reached, so there is no need to dodge between identities unless, I suppose, I decided to write about myself inauthentically, a prospect that doesn't appeal to me whatsoever. I'm too old for that. And so I'm not very surprised that I landed on methodology that hadn't been quite developed in full, braided autoethnography, a methodology that I not at all confidently suggest that I'm using for the first time. There is a researcher, Prittis, 2015, who applied a very similar methodology to her study of perinatal trauma for women who have given birth. And there's another researcher, Stolka Wall, who describes a similar approach, 2018 that is, similar approach, but labels it moderate autoethnography. Nevertheless, braiding evocative with analytic autoethnography stems from the introduction to a chapter in the Handbook of Autoethnography from 2013. And the introduction is written by Barbara Tedlock. In it, Tedlock suggests a braiding of evocative and analytical traditions and autoethnography to, quote, turn inwards towards the self while maintaining the outward gaze and responsibility of autoethnography, unquote. This, after months of reading, seemed to fit my purpose and research question the most closely of any other concept. I could weave my own voice within the voices of others, valuing subjective, relativist interpretations of these voices rather than, as Denzin writes, trying to produce a standard social science article. By deciding to commit to a braided autoethnography to attempt to explore my research question about heterosexual male English teachers and our construction of gender identity, and then articulating that completely unknown methodological framework in my thesis, I felt as if I was describing how the ethos of an entire continent, the continent of ethnography, if you will, influences a very small, remote, barely habited village, the village of braided autoethnography, if you will. I think there might actually only be 4 inhabitants of this village. Tedlock, myself, Pritis, and Stalkawall, and perhaps I'm the only full-time resident. Selection of participants. When I began to consider the identification and selection of participants for interviews, I wanted to find other male secondary school English teachers who taught in private international schools in Singapore so that participants would be complete members of my field. In December 2019, I began researching 7 private international schools' faculty directories for male secondary school English teachers based on names and, when available, photographs. I then began to contact prospective teachers and their department heads via email and phone. After receiving some responses, I selected participants to be interviewed and continued to follow up on other leads. Then COVID-19 hit us all. Of course, this unforeseen and tectonic shift in our lives affected the plans for my research. Fortunately for me, and to the credit of the subjects I had already selected between December and February, they stood by their commitments and agreed to be interviewed over Zoom. I'm still humbled that as we began to worry about the safety of our family and friends, as social freedoms in Singapore were curtailed, and as we shifted to online instruction while our school campuses closed, the subjects still met with me. I interviewed the subjects of my study using a semi-structured framework of questions. The 3 main areas of the question framework were: 1, to allow the subject to discuss his identity as an English teacher; 2, to discuss his ideas about what it means to be a man and to be masculine in the world away from school; and 3, to discuss how those perceptions of self overlapped in the classroom. Also, when I asked my questions, I wanted to explore a modernist dialogic relationship with them so that the friction of our differences was the focus of the interview, and that's from Wegerev 2008. The selection of the participants in my study seems to have allowed for this frictive, revelatory quality in interviews. Because we are heterosexual male secondary private school English teachers, wow, that's a lot of adjectives, I just realized, in Singapore, quite specific similarities and differences regarding our concepts of gender and the presentation of our gender identities inside and outside of the classroom emerged, as one might understand and identify traits when comparing and contrasting styles within a narrow category. So I'd like to now discuss the findings and the braided autoethnography that I wrote. Originally, it had stretched to 40,000 words. And I happily contacted Jo, and she patiently, kindly, but firmly explained that the length for the entire thesis is 45,000 words. So I cut, reduced, revised down to 50 pages and about 15,000 words of my thesis. And so I decided to just kind of play with that a little bit and take parts of that for tonight's presentation. And the presentation that I have right now is, I think, under 3,000 words. And I'm not sure if it really works, but I wanted to give you a sense of what autoethnography is and what I think it means. And so it kind of toggles between my voice in one section and then the voice of a person that I interviewed, a subject that I interviewed in the next, and then back to mine, and then back to theirs. And if you'd like to read along with me, I think you can just take a picture of this QR code with your phone and read along to the selection that I have, with the selection that I have. Okay, so this is my voice to begin. Part 1, UFC Sundays and the End of an Identity. And UFC stands for Ultimate Fighting Championship. It's like boxing and martial arts kind of all mixed into one, where guys and women get into the octagon and they fight. So we are straight men eating meat, drinking, and watching televised violent sports together. It's by a long ways our most comfortable social setting. I would leave these Sunday get-togethers with my mates feeling practically comatose with my overconsumption of food and unsure about why I had just spent 4 hours watching people to try to practically kill each other for sport while I ate like a pig. Also, I didn't feel like I knew any of the men hanging out for the day any better than I did before I had arrived. Rather, I'd only spent more time with them and that demonstration of stoical fortitude was also a demonstration of my willingness to be their friend. In a white heterosexual man's world like the one I inhabit, the emotionally stunted nature of that entire exercise is precisely how one shows one's capability for membership in the group. And so I would go back home on Sunday evening, connect with my family for a while, go to bed, and then wake up on Monday morning to go to school and assume my identity as a secondary school English teacher. After a few years of the UFC Sundays at my friends', I began to seriously question the moment on Monday morning, barely 12 hours after I had been mainlining pork green chili with cheddar on top, screaming at the television when a bloody knockout or bone-breaking submission hold would occur and bring a fighter to the verge of death, when I would ask my students to pull out their notes on, say, the poetry I had assigned for analysis over the weekend. Okay, everyone, what do you think of Carol Ann Duffy's piece? Can we first talk about any images or symbols that seemed important to you as you read the poem? What in the hell was going on here? And whose universe was watching hours of MMA as entertainment and eating belly distending amounts of mincemeat covered in cheese sauce at all compatible with poetry analysis? Mine, apparently. Something was seriously off. I began to think about my masculinity in a different way because of this dissonance. Yes, dear reader, it's true. I have most likely been spurred to a PhD thesis by watching Bloodsport with the boys and eating nachos loaded with minced beef and jalapenos. Things started to become reversed for me. The classroom had been a place where I could behave in a different way than my quote-unquote normal self. However, I was beginning to feel that my normal self existed in the classroom and that my behavior away from it was abnormal. The exchange of those constructed identities seemed to occur at the threshold of the classroom door. It was as if I could perform masculinity in a very definite and culturally acceptable way when I was in the world as a heterosexual father, husband, son, brother, friend, and coach. But my performance of masculinity as a heterosexual teacher was something quite unlike that outside performance. It was emotional, unpredictable, quiet, funny, dramatic, receptive, unsure, queer, radical, feminist, open, honest, organic, true. I stopped attending my friends' gatherings on Sundays after I identified this gap in my perception of myself and the misconstruction and misrepresentation of my own masculinity in the world. My friend continued to invite me for a while, but I would tell him truthfully that I was going to spend some time with my family and that I couldn't make it this time around. Eventually, he stopped inviting me, and I haven't heard from him or any of the other MMA and nachos lads for any social get-togethers since. For me, it was time for a reckoning, and so I write. Braiding it in, Mitchell. I felt a real camaraderie with Mitchell, a secondary school English teacher, from the first time we spoke. His gentleness and ability to reflect upon my questions seemed different than the other subjects I interviewed about this phenomenon. There was a seriousness and an openness about his ability to discuss perhaps challenging ideas in a way that the other subjects did not express. At times, I felt like I was talking with someone who was very much like me regarding the questions I asked him, particularly when he was talking about his gender and its expression in the world. A bit younger than me, Mitchell has been a secondary school English teacher for 15 years. He comes from a more stable background than I do. His father was a doctor and his mother was a nurse. I think there's a difference in being a man and being masculine, he says. I don't think I would do anything to try to perpetuate my masculinity. I've never been in a fight. I'm not an aggressive person. I have a deep, commanding voice, but I don't use that. I think ultimately we have to define masculinity. If we're talking from a basic biological point of view, there are things that happen because of testosterone coursing through our blood. I'm masculine in many ways, but I do not seek out much those tropes of masculinity, I guess, in my relationships or friendships. We end by talking about how our students might perceive us traditionally feminine, as traditionally feminine or something other than masculine. I'll often connect with the girls more than the guys, he says, though I have strong relationships with the guys. The guys, I guess, because of my sense of humor, I can use lighthearted put-downs and things like that. I can do it for the girls and the guys. I guess for the guys, it's kind of expected more, but I guess that's how I kind of build that relationship. With the girls, it takes time. Part 2, present tense, going to school. And so this is back to my part of the narrative of the braided autoethnography. Another night of broken sleep. I can often carry my anxiety from the school day, challenges with students, colleagues, administrators, or parents into my dreams, and it wakes me up around 2 a.m. I remove my horrifyingly embarrassing sleep apnea mask, get out of bed while trying not to wake my wife, go to the living room and lie on the couch. Our dog, Mila, dutifully follows. I usually read on my phone for an hour and a half while wearing my blue light blocking reading glasses, and then go back to bed when I feel tired again. When I reawaken with my alarm at 6:15, I feel like I've been on a long plane flight. I shower, drag a razor over the stubble on my neck, and trim my beard with an electric clipper. I check for and remove renegade nose or ear hair. I lean in and look at my face closely. Shockingly ugly, I think. 15 years ago, I used to feel differently and would think at times, and if the lighting was right, not too bad. Not anymore, that's for sure. There are permanent green-gray bags under my eyes. My forehead is ribboned with 2 major worry lines, a skin tag here, a mole with an uneven edge there. Should I call a doctor? My teeth are irrevocably stained from decades of black coffee. My eyebrows seem to be shrinking inwards from the sides, revealing a kind of bony outcrop. I have a horseshoe of hair around the sides of my head with a thinner expression of it over the top. I'm not fully bald, but not fully hirsute either. A tonsorial middle ground. If I squint, I can see my grandfather Howard and his Navy machinist's haircut staring back at me. All I need are some thickly framed glasses and a burled wood pipe to complete Grandpa Howard's image. Because of a hunch, I recently checked Rembrandt's age when he painted his most famous and most unflattering self-portrait, and my hunch was right. In his withering, unvarnished perspective of himself, he was just about the same age that I am now. I understand Rembrandt's resigned, disgusted, slightly aghast, and ultimately accepting gaze, because I see it in my own eyes every morning. Braiding it in, Dennis. So the idea that I don't necessarily see myself as the authority, as one might implicitly present oneself in that way, I would hope that my students would feel that they could always challenge me and that I would not then be defensive in my response to that and say, no, I'm the only person here who can have those ideas. So I think about masculinity being about modeling what I hope to be the best side of myself. I think that one does that as a teacher very naturally because we see that in the world and it's part of our role. And we hopefully do the same as a parent as well, which I've probably thought about more often. I suggest to Dennis that his concept of gender identity seems to align with an ethic of care. After describing the concept to him, I ask if he feels that his persona changes between the classroom and the world. I expect him to answer affirmatively based on what he said, but he doesn't. No, I don't think it does. Then he says, but once my group or context changes from perhaps within my teacher community, then I would say that again, it depends. Dennis says that he's a certain way with the men in his family, and the males in my family are very much more intellectualized versions of ourselves, and that he'll meet up with old uni mates or friends from other stages in his life, and that, yeah, they'll be slightly different. Interestingly, Dennis then suggests that regarding traditional masculinity and maleness, I think that I'm not necessarily particularly typical. I think that sometimes I get the piss taken out of me for those characteristics. So it's not uncommon amongst my friends to call me a bit metro or to slightly mock me for over-intellectualizing something or being a bit too sincere in the moment. I suggest that these ideas of being caring or open or having a sense of humor or even crying, good qualities of good teaching perhaps, are allowed in the classroom, but maybe not when we leave it. He says, well, I mean, what I'm saying, Josh, is that I wouldn't necessarily say that my experience is that different to yours, but what I would say is that the level of which sometimes people might sort of very nicely and good-humoredly take the piss out of me outside of the classroom would be for those reasons. Part 3, constructing masculine identity when I'm teaching, beginning the lesson. As I transform at the classroom door, I genuinely laugh and smile when I see my students arrive. I do not feel, nor want to feel, traditionally masculine or manly or powerful or strong or controlling. I feel caring, not righteous. I feel receptive, not dominant. I feel like a collaborator, not a leader. I'm greeting each student by name. I'm giving high fives, or in the age of COVID, air high fives. I'm asking students how they've been, even extending little inside jokes that have developed over the course of the term. If there's a student who looks troubled, I make a mental note. Also, if I need to speak with a student about missing work or an absence or otherwise, I try to have them wait for a moment so that we can chat. I don't want to do it in the classroom in front of the class where they might feel more exposed and vulnerable. If a student has experienced something difficult, such as a death in the family or a cancer diagnosis of a relative or a serious injury, I make sure to speak with them about it here and listen to them. I need them to understand that more than anything else, I care about what's happening in their lives. I don't try and show that I care, rather I do care. I feel that the more I reveal myself in caring ways that are contextual for my role as a teacher, rather than in less caring and more stereotypical ways that I might act as a man in the world, the more my students seem to connect with me. This creates a feedback loop. They seem more eager to know me, and I feel more eager to know them. Just this week, as I said and revised this draft, 2 boys wrote me emails to see how I was doing after I had to leave school to take my son to the A&E. And another boy asked me about it in class. Just yesterday, 2 girls, former students, stopped by on their lunch break to say hello and catch up. I think that I'm lucky as a teacher to have these kinds of interactions with my students, and I think they're directly the result of my choice to turn away from hegemonically masculine ways of presenting my identity in the classroom. Braiding it in, Tom. I get to the point in the interview, as the interview is coming to an end, and ask, do you feel that your presentation of your masculinity in the English classroom is something other than stereotypically heterosexual? Is it more feminine than your presentation of yourself outside of the classroom? His clearest answer emerges, and I feel tension. His answer is abrupt, almost as if I've insulted him. It feels defensive. Not for me. I don't think so. My presentation is pretty straightforward, and as much as I'd like to think I can adopt and present from a different perspective, I really doubt that I do. I'm not satisfied with that answer, and I press Tom a bit. Can I ask you why not? Why do you doubt that you do? Yeah, I guess just feeling comfortable with who I am, right? I've always been big. My thinking there goes with just how does someone know they've been misassigned their sex in a transgender sense? Men and women probably think differently, right? The crass analogy is that it's just a matter of plumbing, right? How do you know that that was a mistake? What is it that makes you convinced that it's something feminine or masculine inside you that's been wrongly assigned? And I think I can sympathize with and certainly empathize with most positions of other, but that's just when I struggle to try and understand, right? And I don't think I understand it. Thus, can I really present from something other than who I am? And being confident that, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be. This is how it is. I'm unmoored by Tom's answer here. Part 4, the mini lesson, the conference, and the conclusion. I'll often feel joy in the closing minutes of a class period, not because it's over, although sometimes, but because it's occurred and I've been part of it. Words that come to mind here: ebullience, happiness, relief, camaraderie, hope, gratitude, thankfulness, humility, grace. I like to take time to remind them how smart they are and that if they work hard on our assignments, they can accomplish what they like in the course. I'll also try to remember and highlight what a particular student has said or done to stand out during the period, often a student who's marginalized in some way. I'll say, I really appreciated when X treated Y in an academically respectful manner, giving Y the credit for an idea that came up in a small group. Or I heard Z say something at a conference that was really just incredibly intelligent, and I appreciated that. I feel very powerful during these minutes, as if I am, and readers and listeners, please forgive my earnestness here, touching the future. During these moments, I feel that teaching secondary school English is the most influential profession I could have chosen for myself. Again, I stand at the door, regaining the threshold between worlds, and dismiss the students. I try and say their names one last time and give high fives. I extend jokes that have come up. I tell particular students I've appreciated their efforts. I gently remind students to finish late work that's overdue. If I can be fully in the moment, I can tell students who are experiencing difficulty away from the classroom that I'm thinking about their situation and their lives, and that I hope things get better before we see each other again. Sometimes if there's a troubled student who seems completely cut off, I'll ask them to wait just a moment as the rest of the students file out, and then I'll have a word with them to check in and see what's happening. Almost always, a student will tell me about a sick relative, or a breakup, or a bad grade, or a friend who was unkind, or something else troubling them. I try to listen rather than speak, and they seem to appreciate that very much. Again, my behavior here is quite different than how I might behave in the world away from my classroom as I present myself as a man. Okay, so that was the selection of the braided autoethnography that I wanted to read. And for the next part of tonight, the presentation, I'd like to discuss the findings from that braided autoethnography as they apply to theory. And I'll just go through the kinds of theory that I discussed earlier in the presentation, and then how that helped me come to some conclusions in the findings section of my research. So application of the theory of hegemonic masculinity and an ethic of care to findings. Connell's 1991 theory regarding hegemonic masculinity relates within my findings. My search for research subjects itself was based on sex role and vocation, male secondary school English teachers, and my method of finding data was also influenced in these ways. I used my power, position, and authority as a male PhD researcher to contact other men in my field whom I did not know, and to suggest that I would require a considerable amount of their time in an interview to help me with my research. One can infer that because of my privileged status within society, these men who did agree to speak with me understood implicitly that I had masculine power and agency in a world that prioritizes male privilege and authority, and that's from Bourdieu, 2001. These questions of how and why heterosexual male English teachers show caring is an area for further research. In other words, it is socially acceptable to be a heterosexual male English teacher, despite, as Pachter 2000 suggests, societal associations of occupation, teacher, and subject English with women. But when considering the findings of my research study, it became apparent that we men were recuperating our masculinity in various ways, weaving our identities into a complex and idiosyncratic tapestry of our various interpretations of what masculinity means. Gilligan, 1982, suggests that our success as caring male teachers would actually require these displays of masculinity in various forms in order to be socially acceptable, which brings me back to the questions of how and why we present our masculinities in the classroom. Qualitative ethnographic research into these questions seems as if it could be limitless, and for me, fascinating. Application of the theory of gender identity to findings. Asking the interview subjects to discuss their conceptions of their own constructions of gender identity inside and outside of the secondary school English classroom seemed to push them towards a description of themselves that suggested an essential or traditional performance of masculinity in the manner, as Warren 2010 suggests, a snail maintains its shell, rather than how a chameleon might change its color in varied contexts. The men I interviewed generally cast off the snail shell at key moments when something different than a display of heterosexual masculinity was required in class or at times or otherwise, but then suggested a return to it when the context had changed. This use of masculinity for one's own advantage to enter and exit the shell as needed ultimately helps maintain a hegemonically masculinized educational landscape. Of the men I interviewed, I consider two of them to be adherents to the, as Kimmel 2009 suggests, trope of hypermasculinity. These men seem reluctant to express their identity as anything other than masculine and refer to their female partners as a foil or reverse image to excuse their own less than masculine traits. Both men clearly describe themselves as being masculine inside and outside of the classroom, no break in identity. Additionally, subject Tom rejected the idea of being able to adjust or contextualize one's gender expression. For Tom, sex role and gender identity are fixed and congruent because, as he said, it's just a matter of plumbing, isn't it? And because he's comfortable with himself and that he wasn't one to trouble that implied and fixed relationship. It's precisely for teachers like Tom and the hundreds of Toms I've worked with and continue to work with in my career that I've begun to think about extensions of this research into new projects such as teacher training. Application of pedagogical theory to teacher training. Simpson 2001 suggested that a Deweyan insistence upon the care and success of the individual student is an important part of feminist theory in education, that the well-being of and care for the individual student supersedes any kind of desired educational outcome or neoliberalized performance target. The research subject's dedication to individual students in their classroom rejects the kind of masculinized neoliberal teaching that Ball 2003 suggests is disingenuous and performative. Popkowitz 2012 describes the focus on individual success rather than on a cultural expectation for achievement as a reduction in the abjection of individual experience, a feminist tenet. All the men I interviewed seemed committed to this concept and that each and every student in his class was worthy of inclusion. This commitment to inclusivity and the success of each student in the heterosexual secondary school male English teacher's classroom is an interesting finding. While the men involved in the study did not describe having to interrupt their performance of masculinity in order to be a secondary school English teacher, they did choose to make allowances for the kind of focused individual care that might be pathologized in men's behavior outside of the classroom. This finding is encouraging and warrants further study. Application of queer educational theory to findings. Queer educational theory also resonates within my findings. Francis 2012 comments upon the intentional problematization of gender constancy within queer theory and recasts Waring's 2010 comment upon the contextual, fluid expression of one's gender identity. The men in my study were not necessarily aware of Francis's suggestion of heteroglossic constructions of gender for the purpose of the classroom, but were aware of the masculine identities as monoglossic extensions of their true selves, a fixed or unchangeable mark that would both support and result from the imbricate nature of hegemonic masculinity. In a landscape writ large societally, writ small educationally, and writ even smaller when considered as the landscape within the walls of one's own secondary school English classroom that valorizes heterosexual masculine expression, the men in my study had no real impetus to be anything other than traditionally masculine, inside or outside of the classroom, perhaps because of the pathologizing of homosexuality and queerness in heteronormative, hegemonically masculine society. The troubling of heterosexual male teachers' conceptions of a fixed gender identity warrants further study and theoretical development. Application of braided autoethnographic methodology and writing as method to findings. Contextually, the methodology of braided autoethnography, which emerges from Ted Locke's concept, as well as the method of writing as method, have allowed me to consider and present my own experiences as a complete member researcher, or CMR, in the ethnographic field being researched. This position of subjectivity, according to Waring in 2010, a feminist researcher's perspective, with which I can, according to Toronto in 1993, consider my privileged irresponsibly, and question, according to Lingard and Douglas, 1999, my patriarchal dividend, and according to Bourdieu in 2001, perform a labor of symbolic destruction and consequent construction. I just wanted to point out that as a PhD student, that paragraph that I just read took me 4 books to write. So I just thought I'd mention that. I was very proud of that paragraph. It's just one of those paragraphs. Okay. It's also of no little consequence that throughout this research, I've continued my career as a secondary school English teacher and have reconsidered my gender expression in real time each day with my students. The world of my PhD research and the world of my classroom have become increasingly concordant as the days, weeks, months, and years have passed. At times, my awareness of my own heteronormative, traditionally masculine tendencies and habits towards an expression of identity were and are so obvious to myself, but perhaps not to my students, colleagues, or even my family, that I could not help but feel something like a coalescence of incredulity and embarrassment and shame, or even a kind of deep sarcasm and Black humor. This constantly iterative plate, if you will, of the braided autoethnographic research has been fascinating and even exciting to consider. I would go so far as to say that the heightened and theoretically bolstered awareness of my own expression of gender identity in the classroom has become something heteroglossic, fluid, and alive. Perhaps Ellis and Bachner, 2016, were quite right when they suggested that autoethnographic research can become a way of life. The recommendations that come from my research, there are three of them that I'd like to recommend. The first one is to continue research researching this question and variations of it. The research question for this project, how and why do heterosexual men present gender in the secondary English classroom, is one that is open for more research than my study has considered. Of course, I hope to have the opportunity to continue researching this question as written. However, variations upon this question are also important to consider. The question's syntax could accommodate them. For instance, a qualitative ethnographic study of the experience of homosexual male teachers in the presentation of gender in the secondary English classroom would be important to broaden the findings of this initial research. A similar study focusing on the experience of women who teach secondary school English and their presentation of gender would be important, as well as a study of how transgender teachers experience the presentation of gender in a secondary school English classroom. Furthermore, studies which qualitatively investigate the experiences of secondary teachers, regardless of sex role, sexuality, or subject area of expertise, and their presentation of gender in the classroom would be important for furthering this study's initial implications for what we now know. Recommendation 2, develop a braided autoethnographic research framework. 2 suggestions for further developing the method of braided autoethnography are described here. My first suggestion is to clearly describe the positioning of the researcher. The tool of braided autoethnography necessitates the ethnographer's commitment to and belief in the relativistic and anti-foundational nature of lived experience. Meaning is described rather than objectively revealed. Therefore, the braided autoethnographer must use their descriptive writing skills to evoke the lived experience of other CMRs within a field and use others' experiences as filters, sounding boards, obstacles, and/or loudspeakers for one's own lived experience. A second suggestion is to create a methodological framework for braided autoethnographers. This framework could describe how to position oneself as a researcher, how to identify complete member researchers in the field, how to collect data through semi-structured interviews. More importantly, however, this framework could outline how a braided autoethnographer can write the narratives of others' lived experiences and position those narratives as previously described relative to one's own experience in an iterative, organic way via writing as method. Recommendation 3, develop and plan a teacher training program. Gender sensitivity training is recognized in the field of education. Gender sensitivity training programs generally have one of 2 foci. Teachers can be more aware of and sensitive to the gender identities of their students, and teachers can be more aware of and sensitive to the gender identities of their colleagues. However, there is little research or programming to suggest that heterosexual male school teachers, perhaps unintentionally but nevertheless, continue the maintenance and structure of a hegemonically masculine society because of their own presentation of gender in the classroom. The findings of my research would suggest that even the most introductory readings and discussions of the concept of hegemonic masculinity or traditionally masculine tropes of being could go quite far in raising awareness of heterosexual male educators about our implied cultural power and why it exists and why it's important to further become aware of its influence upon our pedagogy. Furthermore, a teacher training developed in tandem with an educational psychologist could help create a framework for men who teach school to discuss the more challenging or toxic qualities of our masculinities, rather than using them or perhaps hiding them and behaving as if they do not exist. What if heterosexual men were given safe spaces via training to reconsider and recast their own expressions of masculinity in the classroom? This kind of training could ameliorate, broadly, issues of equity and social justice in education. This is my contribution to knowledge and where my research is located and situated. My research is built upon the work of others, Specifically, I've relied upon Raewyn Connell and his theory of hegemonic masculinity to consider how I and other heterosexual male English teachers can frame our gender expression inside and outside of the classroom. Furthermore, Carol Gilligan's Framework for the Ethic of Care, 1982, has given me language to help describe how I feel and has created an important and necessary dissonance for my consideration of gender and identity in the secondary school English classroom. I've also relied upon Jo Warin's research and language regarding the expression of gender and identity, And Wayne Martino's research in language has helped me understand and define what's beyond heteronormative tropes of expression for teachers. If I were to arrange the aforementioned 4 areas of scholarship into a diagram, their imbricate nature would be apparent. One can understand how Gilligan's ethic of care would resonate with Connell's theory of hegemonic masculinity, for instance. Or one can also understand how Warren's descriptions of gender and identity can echo within Martino's research regarding the disruption of heteronormative gender expression in education. However, if I attempted to pull the 4 circles together to create the intended effect, in the center of the Venn diagram, I would instead have a space in that center where the circles nearly but do not overlap. That formerly blank center is where my research now exists, and the filling of that previously vacant space with my work is why my research is a contribution to knowledge. Because of this thesis, we now know more about the 4 aforementioned areas of scholarship, and we now know something about how and why male heterosexual secondary English teachers present gender and masculinity in the classroom. And just as a final slide, this is my list of references, and if you wanted to take a picture of that with your phone, that will take you to the list of references, I believe as a PDF that you can have a look at. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Thanks very much indeed for that incredibly scholarly and highly engaging presentation. And I found I was engaged by it anew, even though I'm familiar with the content. So thanks very much. Also for that neat trick, it's completely new to me, of using the QR code and reading alongside on my phone. I have no idea how you do that, but it's maybe something I want to learn. So I'm now going to look at the chat and also encourage people that if they want to ask you a question, could you please unmute and turn on your camera so that I can, and wave your hand clearly so that I can see your questions. And I'm seeing some very strong praise in the chat, but has anybody got any questions that they would like to ask? I see Chris Marlowe's camera on. Hi, Chris.
Hello there. Hello, Joe. Hello, everyone. Well done, Josh. Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. I just wondered if I could ask you a question. Much of your work is grounded in Connell's work on hegemonic masculinities, and you suggested that your participants were very grounded in traditional notions of masculinity. I just wondered if any of the data suggests that your participants are aware of or are enacting anything that we might deem as sort of the changing nature of masculinities, a more inclusive version of masculinity, or masculinities plural.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, Chris. And I wanted to, this is the first time I've actually had the opportunity to talk with you. And so thank you for helping me earlier in the program when I reached out to you. I really appreciate that very much.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
I do think that they did suggest ideas about inclusive masculinities, and I do think that they would be open to learning more about it. Like when you were asking me those questions, I was thinking that that could be more ground for teacher training to help teachers understand what that means and what that concept is, even if they are performing it or behaving in those ways without necessarily being able to attach the idea to it. I did get the feeling that some of the men that I interviewed did behave more inclusively than perhaps traditionally or essentialized masculinity would suggest. But that is definitely something for further research.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Josh. And I've seen that Sally Welsh and Thomas Kral have also got questions to ask. I'm not sure which of you went first, but Sally, let's go to you, and then we'll come to Thomas.
Thank you, Josh. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was fascinating. I used to be an English teacher, so I was very interested, a secondary school English teacher, yes, for a long time. I might have missed it. Did you say how many participants you spoke to? And alongside that, what nationality were the participants, and did that have any effect really on their view of their masculinity? One of the reasons I'm asking that is because I've just been collecting data for my own study, and I've interviewed some men. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the men talk, I'm based in the northeast of England, and the men that I've interviewed, it's nothing to do with my research question, but they all talk about drinking. They all talk about drinking alcohol, and the women don't. But I've interviewed a Romanian man and a Greek man, and it didn't come up in their interviews at all. So that was just what set me thinking about it. But I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much indeed. It was brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. I appreciate that. And it's good to meet a fellow high school English teacher, former English teacher.
Former,
yeah. So I ended up interviewing 4 men, and 3 of the men that I interviewed were English, and 1 man was an American. And I felt that the English subjects that I interviewed were much more, I guess, cognizant or aware of the concepts that I was discussing. Like, they could discuss masculinities and femininities and context and things like that. And the American man that I did interview was not able to do that. He was much more straightforward about it. The Europeans that I interviewed were, I think, much more conversational with the concepts that I was talking about, where the American perhaps felt ambushed or something like that. And all 4 of the men that I interviewed did discuss drinking as an expression of masculinity. Like, that was almost a default, and how they felt comfortable in situations being a man watching football at a bar. And that's something that I've talked with Joe about quite a lot too, just about this sort of, for secondary school English men who teach English, this sort of easy mantle of feminism that we can don when we go to class. And then when we leave, we can go down the pub, and maybe that's not terribly genuine or healthy.
Okay, yes, fascinating. And of course, well, you mentioned our colleague Steve Dempster's work on that too, which is well worth reading. Sukaina and Thomas, I said, Thomas, you would be next, but I've also noted that Sukaina has a question. So Thomas, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Josh. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I really learned a lot, and your methodology is actually what's kind of what prompted me to participate in the webinar today. The braided autoethnography is something that I'm quite interested in, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, just to clarify what exactly kind of that means and how you ended up choosing this particular methodology, because I'm interested in also doing kind of something called a collective autoethnography involving several kind of potential researchers or kind of participant researchers in my own thesis. And I'm wondering how those 2 ideas intersect, and what I saw that the braided part was really the semi-structured interviews that you conducted. So yeah, I was wondering if you could just kind of speak a little bit more about how that methodology came about in your study, and whether it was kind of a collective or a group autoethnography to some extent.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a great question. And I hope you were able to email me more about your approach. I'd like to know more about that. I don't know much about collective autoethnography, but the idea for braided autoethnography emerges from, I guess, the 2 schools of thought within autoethnography, which are evocative and analytical. And evocative autoethnography emerges from the work of Carolyn Ellis and Arthur Bachner. And I think Ellis was first, but then Ellis and Bachner started working together, and their book in 2016, I think it's titled, it could be called Evocative Ethnography, but they sort of pushed forward with it. And then after Evocative Ethnography, then a researcher and writer named Anderson in 2005 pushes back, and he sort of creates an idea called analytic autoethnography to push back against what he thinks is very subjective and very almost creative nonfiction kind of writing. And he said it's not suitable for the academy, and that we have to do something that maintains what power autoethnography can have, but it has to be relevant for sociology. And so Tedlock then comes in 2013, and Tedlock argues just in this really small way, like really nowhere else in the literature, in the chapter heading of the Handbook of Autoethnography, and argues for braiding those two ideas together so that you can look outward while looking inwards. And I think I quoted that in the speech tonight, but that's sort of the gist of it, and the idea of the positioning of the researcher, where you're not just looking at your own subjective experience, but you're listening to the voices of others and then representing them in the way that you like. And so I don't think that there's agency from the people that I interviewed to sort of craft the narratives in the way that they might. Like, I do have the agency over that. So I'm presenting their voices in the way that I feel like they should be presented. So that could differ from the approach that I might have inferred from you, but that's really where braided autoethnography comes from, is from Tedlock's suggestion of the concept. And then I just tried to make that actionable. And there was a researcher in 2016, Pritis, who I found after I turned in my thesis, actually. She used something very much like braided autoethnography, discussing women and their experiences with perinatal trauma after childbirth, and really similar to what I had argued for with my methodology. So. Okay,
that's great. Thank you. Yeah, the one that I was talking about, the kind of the collective autoethnography is, a much more kind of profound or closer engagement with the participants, where you establish a relationship with them, and then collectively you study the topic at hand. So, and the people you interviewed, you didn't know, you elicited them from the sites. So yeah.
One thing that I just remembered about braided autoethnography is that you should be a complete member researcher of the field that you're investigating. So I think that differs from I'm not sure that I would be finding people, I would find people in a situation or in a field in which I'm not involved with braided autoethnography. So for me to be somebody who can speak the language that we can both talk about, and I think that was key for braided autoethnography as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. That's really helpful.
Okay, thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, both of you, for that, because I know there's many people interested in this. And colleagues may remember that Tony Adams did a department seminar a few weeks ago, and that's, I guess we've got the recording for that. If anybody else wants to follow up on different ways of doing autoethnography. Okay, Sukaina, you had a question too.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Josh, thank you for the excellent seminar. Once again, it was a pleasure to hear you again. My question are in two parts. Number one, I think the first one I'd already asked you in your earlier presentation in terms of looking at different cultural connotations as well. So, and you did say maybe that was something that could be looked at later on. But do you think there's space within it in this point in your discussion, or that's something that cannot come in at all? And secondly, I like the way when you are actually discussing the braided and you are giving all that different understanding. How did you actually manage to sort of differentiate? How do you actually remove yourself and then go back to the voice of the third person in your writing as well? how did you manage the balance? And I'm asking you so that we can all hear as well of your experiences of writing your research.
Thanks, Sukaina. It's good to see you again. Thank you for the question. And the first part of the question, I think that at this point in my dissertation, there might not be time to go back to look at the question through those lenses. But I do think that those lenses of different cultures and expressions in the classroom would be really rich for further research that I'd love to participate in, actually. And I think it's a great idea. So maybe we can talk more about it. And as far as the writing bit and how to braid the interviews and ideas from the men that I researched and interviewed, first was pretty straightforward as far as semi-structured interviewed and qualitative research methodology goes. I interviewed them and then transcribed those interviews. And I chose to do it by hand and not do any other way because I really wanted to understand the essence of what they said. And I think that took a lot of time and was a lot more work, but I think it really paid off because then I could understand exactly what they were saying to me and I could recall the conversation really clearly and make notes as I was transcribing. But the other big influence in that area of how to write about those well is from a researcher named Elizabeth Adams St. Pierre, and she's at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. And she wrote in 2018 about writing as method. And her commentary about writing as method and about how to trust yourself to go beyond the methodological enclosure with interpreting data from what you've collected gave me confidence and kind of gave me the theoretical understanding of why I was doing what I was doing subjectively with the interpretations of the transcriptions that I had made. So I do feel that Adam St. Pierre's work was really influential upon me as far as writing as method, and I would recommend her work to you.
Thank you, Josh.
Okay.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Sukaina.
Thanks. And I think actually your response there to Sukaina has, in fact, just pretty much answered a question that's been posted in the chat, a follow-up question from Sally. But I don't know whether you can see the question, Josh. I'll just read it out anyway.
Yeah,
you see it? Yeah. So, I mean, she's asking about whether you write the extracts pre or post analysis, and your answer about writing as method is an answer to that. But you might want to answer that question yourself and just just summarize.
I think it's a great question, and I think Adam St. Pierre 2018 gives the suggestion that if we do engage with writing as method, that there's not a right RIGHT way to do it. So for me, I think that the extracts that I dealt with, to use the language in your question, I did it post. I wrote them post analysis, if I understand what you're asking. So I transcribed them, I thought about them, and then I wrote them up as closely as I could to invoke how I felt during those experiences as I was interviewing the men. Then after I got those I didn't even know how long they would be, Sally. Like when I was writing them, I didn't know what I was writing really. There wasn't a form for it. And so I think they started to be like 7,000 words each or 8,000 words each or something like that. And then as I started to kind of feel like the organic nature of the braided autoethnography and how these parts might fit together, I wanted to make them balanced somehow. And I knew I only had, say, 15,000 words of space in my dissertation to do that. And so that helped me, and I think I'm getting off of your question now, but that helped me sort of contain what it was that I came up with. So I guess there were 3 steps to it. I transcribed it, I saw what I had, and then I wrote what I didn't even know what it would be. And then I started to shape it and form it into something and decided to use italics and use borders around it to give like these text features that would set it off from my own writing. But I didn't want to have like cheesy transitions or anything like that between my writing and their writing and make it flow. Like I really didn't want that. I wanted it to be jarring and harsh between the parts because my voice is not theirs. So, yeah.
Thank you, Josh. That's a really brilliant answer. Thank you. I'm interested in doing some creative writing as well, but not creative writing, that's not the right term, but yeah, doing something different with the presentation of my data, but I'm nowhere near the stage that you're at. But thank you. That's really fascinating. Thanks for being so open as well.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Oh, yes, I do. Oh, no, no, it's not a question, but it's Carolyn saying she needs to go. Thanks for coming, Carolyn. And maybe, okay, thanks. Let me see if there's anybody else. I don't see anybody else with a hand up, with a camera on. I don't see any other questions. We've had a very good rinsing of certainly. Oh, go on. Who's that?
Sorry, Joe. Can I just
now.
ask sort of yeah. Can I just ask sort of a personal journey question to Josh? So, Josh, thinking from where you started off your journey of the PhD, that's linking back to coursework and everything, and then to where you are now. Can you sort of describe what were your hurdles and what are your achievements in between, and how do you feel?
Can you say the middle part of your question again, Sukaina? I didn't get that.
Yes, so I'm talking about when you actually started your PhD journey. So going back to coursework and everything else that was there, and coming to where you are now. So if you were to have a reflective moment, how do you feel in terms of what are your hurdles, your achievements, and sort of any motivations just to keep us going as well? Thank you.
That's a great question, Sukaina. That's hard to answer. I feel like I was really lucky to have a great supervisor. I feel like Joe has been wonderful and that I've been able to learn so much. And I'd say this if she wasn't here. I've been able to really just learn so much about how to take part 2 of our program from Joe, because I really had no idea. So having a great supervisor has been fundamental. I guess, how I feel right now, Sukaina, I feel happy and kind of scared for the Viva coming up. So just, I'm relieved to have, done the coursework and gotten to this point, I guess, but I feel like there's a lot more to do. And I feel like, I feel like I'm just going to have to keep trying to do what I've been doing, which is just one day at a time. When I was in the coursework, I remember feeling quite overwhelmed at times. Like in part 1, I would feel overwhelmed and I would regularly have to just keep it to even just an hour. Like, okay, I'm just going to need to do this for an hour, and then I can move on and maybe think about something else. And so I think just sort of managing that feeling of being overwhelmed and just relying on that old strategy of, okay, I can set my iPhone for an hour and do whatever I need to do for an hour and then see how I feel after that. That's very helpful for me. Also, something that I've been reading about quite a bit is something called imposter syndrome for PhD students and people who are about to give the Viva, where you feel like you just don't know what you're talking about and that you're not very knowledgeable. And so it's been helpful to read about that and find people who have been through it and kind of talk about, you do have things that are worthwhile to talk about and you are making a contribution to knowledge and you have gone this far in your program. And so that means something. And so just trying to listen to those positive voices too about, the work has been worth it. So yeah, I feel really, really quite happy to be here, but also a little nervous about what's coming up, but I really have appreciated becoming your friend in the program, Sukaina, and I am glad that we're communicating.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Josh. And from what I've seen of your work, I can say, yes, you have gone through a long journey. You've contributed well. I equally agree with you about having Joe as a supervisor, and you've had a lot of motivation as well. So thank you very much for sharing your journey. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I'm sure you'll do well in the Viva.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Sukaina, and thanks to both of you for your very kind words. They're really appreciated. And Josh, thanks for your honesty, about the process you've been through, because I think that is incredibly helpful for other people on doing the program as well, and other people doing PhDs. I'm just looking at the names who are still here. So I don't know whether there's any further questions. I see people leaving in the chat and thanking you. And I don't see any more questions, and we're almost out of time anyway. So I think, this is just, and there's a clap there from Chan, and, fantastically kind praising words in the chat. So I think it just remains for me to say, a heartfelt good luck, which is echoed in lots of the contributions on the chat. Lots of people wishing you good luck in the Viva, and many, many thanks for such a really engaging, fantastic presentation.
Okay.
So I shall now say goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe, for hosting. I really appreciate that. Thanks for your time. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate your time.
And actually, just a quick useful question there from Jan. She says, a technical question. She like me, would like you to see a lot of the words of praise and good wishes for the Viva, because that's such a nice confidence boosting thing. And will you get a copy of that? I think that's a question. And Kyungmi is nodding her head. Yeah, so that will be great. And thanks also to Rebecca and Kyungmi and Dee Dalgleish, that fantastic team that are the behind the stage bringers of these department seminars. So thanks to everybody, and goodbye, everybody.